There are moments in life when the universe tests us, when destiny disguises itself in rags and walks past us on a dusty road, when greatness hides behind closed eyes and waits to see if we will look with our hearts instead of our hands. This is a story about such a moment, about a young man who had nothing but gave everything, about a blind man who saw more than those with sight, and about a city that learned the most powerful lesson of all, that kindness is never wasted, that humility opens doors no key can unlock, and that the greatest among us often walk unrecognized until the moment arrives for truth to reveal itself. Listen carefully, for what I am about to tell you happened long ago in a city not unlike any city you know, where the wealthy lived behind high walls and the poor slept under stars, where merchants shouted prices and beggars whispered prayers, where life moved like a river, sometimes gentle, sometimes harsh, but always flowing toward the ocean of destiny that awaits us all. His name was Kwame, and he was nobody special, or so the world believed. 23 years old, no parents to speak of, no inheritance waiting in some forgotten corner, no family name that opened doors or softened hearts. He lived in a single room at the edge of the city, a room so small that when he stretched his arms, his fingers touched opposite walls. Each morning before the sun remembered its duty, Kwame would wake and walk the 3 miles to the quarry where men broke stones for the roads that wealthy feet would never feel. His hands were calloused and cracked, his back bent from labor that paid barely enough to buy yesterday's bread at half price, his feet tough as leather from walking paths that shoes had long since abandoned. But Kwame had something that poverty could not steal, something that hardship could not diminish. He had a heart that still believed kindness mattered, even when the world had given him every reason to believe otherwise. The morning this story truly begins started like any other morning. Kwame rose in darkness, splashed his face with water he had carried from the public well the night before, and ate a small piece of cassava left from yesterday's meal. He wrapped his only other shirt, the one with fewer patches, in a cloth bundle in case the quarrymaster needed him to run errands in the better parts of the city, though this rarely happened to men of his station. As he stepped into the street, the city was still sleeping that deep sleep that comes just before dawn, when even the dogs have given up barking and the night insects have finished their songs. The air was cool and clean, not yet choked with the dust that would rise once the day's activities began. Kwame liked this hour, this quiet time when he could walk and think, and remember his mother's voice telling him stories about heroes and wise men, about gods who walked among mortals in disguise, about rewards that came to those who kept their hearts pure even when their stomachs were empty. He had walked perhaps a mile when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the dawn chorus of waking birds and distant roosters. It was a human sound, a shuffling of feet, uncertain and slow, accompanied by the tap-tap-tap of wood against stone. Kwame stopped and listened, his quarry-trained ears picking up the rhythm of someone moving with great difficulty, someone who could not see where their next step would land. He turned toward the sound and saw, emerging from a side alley where shadows still clung like frightened children, a figure that would change his life forever, though he could not know this yet. The figure was an old man, or at least he appeared old, bent with either years or burden, wrapped in cloth that might once have been fine but was now so dirty and torn that its original quality was impossible to determine. In his right hand, he carried a walking stick, not the polished kind that wealthy men used for decoration, but a simple branch, weathered and worn from hard use. His eyes were closed, or perhaps they were open but saw nothing. It was difficult to tell in the dim light. But the way he moved, the way his stick swept the ground before him, the way his head tilted to listen for obstacles, told Kwame everything he needed to know. The blind man stumbled, his foot catching on a stone that jutted from the street. He did not fall, but the stumble was violent enough that he gasped and clutched his walking stick more tightly, his body tensing as if expecting the ground to betray him again. Kwame felt something move in his chest, something that rose up before his mind could calculate the cost or measure the convenience. Without thinking, without weighing whether this would make him late for work, or whether this man deserved his help, or whether anyone was watching who might reward him for his kindness, Kwame simply moved forward. "Elder," he called softly, using the respectful term his mother had taught him to use for those whose years exceeded his own. The street is uneven here. May I offer you my arm until the path becomes smoother?" His voice was gentle, the way one might speak to a frightened animal or a worried child, carrying no pity in it, only honest concern from one human being to another who needed help in that moment. The blind man stopped moving, his head turning toward Kwame's voice with such precision that for a moment Kwame wondered if the man could actually see. The face that turned toward him was weathered like ancient wood left too long in sun and rain, creased with lines that told of years beyond counting or perhaps of sorrows that aged a man faster than time alone could manage. The eyes that saw nothing seemed nevertheless to look directly at Kwame, into him, through him, reading something written in his voice or his heartbeat or his soul that those with perfect vision might have missed entirely. For a long moment, the blind man said nothing, and Kwame began to wonder if he had offended the elder by suggesting he needed help. For pride can be the last possession a man refuses to surrender even when everything else has been stripped away. But then the blind man's face shifted, something that might have been a smile touching the corners of his mouth, a smile that somehow made him look younger despite his years, more regal despite his rags. "You speak with kindness in your voice, young man," the blind man said, and his voice was not the cracked whisper Kwame had expected, but instead clear and measured, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard, though it was softened now by something that might have been weariness or sadness or both together. "In this city, kindness has become as rare as rain in the dry season. Most people hurry past me as if I am invisible, or worse, as if I am a curse they fear might spread by contact. You ask if you may help me, and I say yes. I would be grateful for your arm and your guidance, for I am lost in streets I once knew as well as my own name, and I need to reach the eastern gate before the sun climbs too high." He extended his hand, not groping blindly as many sightless people must do, but reaching with surprising accuracy toward where Kwame stood, as if some sense beyond sight told him exactly where the young man's shoulder would be. Kwame took the old man's hand and felt it was rough with calluses, but also strangely soft in places, as if it had known both hard work and luxury, both struggle and comfort, though which had come first was impossible to determine. "The eastern gate is far, elder, perhaps 2 miles or more," Kwame said, concern creeping into his voice, for the sun was already painting the horizon with the colors that announced its imminent arrival, and the quarrymaster was not a patient man with those who arrived after the morning bell. "I must go to the quarry for my work, but the path I take goes toward the eastern part of the city. I can walk with you at least that far, and perhaps we will find someone closer to the gate who can help you the rest of the way." He did not mention that walking slowly with the blind man would certainly make him late, that being late would cost him a portion of his already meager wages, that the quarry master might even dismiss him entirely if he arrived after work had begun. These calculations flashed through his mind like lightning, but just as quickly they were dismissed, pushed aside by something stronger than self-interest, something his mother had planted in him years ago when she was still alive, to tend such seeds. "Can you tell me why you need to reach the eastern gate, elder? Perhaps I know someone there who could assist you further." The blind man was quiet for several steps, the rhythm of his walking stick maintaining a steady beat against the awakening street. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something that might have been sadness, or might have been resignation, or might have been something else entirely, something harder to name. "I go to meet someone who has long awaited my return, though I fear I have delayed too long, and the one who waits may have given up hoping. As for why I walk these streets blind and lost, when once I could have summoned 100 men to carry me wherever I wished, that is a story too long and too painful for such a short journey, though perhaps the journey will be longer than I think if you stay with me. And if you stay, perhaps the story will tell itself without me having to force the words." He paused, his grip on Kwame's arm tightening slightly, not from weakness, but from something else, perhaps from the weight of memory or the burden of regret. "Tell me, young man, what is your name, and what manner of work takes you from your bed before the sun has properly risen?" "My name is Kwame, elder, and I break stones at the quarry south of the city, stones that become roads and walls and foundations for buildings I will never enter," Kwame replied, his voice holding no bitterness, only simple statement of fact, the way one might report the weather or describe the color of the sky. I have done this work for 5 years now, since my mother passed, and I was old enough to earn my own bread. It is hard work, but it is honest work, and honest work is better than stealing or begging, or so my mother always told me." They had reached the public well now, and Kwame paused, recognizing that the blind man's breathing had become labored, that the old man needed rest even though they had traveled less than half the distance to the eastern gate. "Elder, let me bring you water before we continue. The sun is rising fast, and the heat will make our journey more difficult." Without waiting for permission, Kwame guided the blind man to sit on a low wall surrounding the well, then drew water with the shared cup that hung from a rope for all to use. He held the cup to the blind man's lips with the same care one might use for a sick child, watching to make sure the elder drank, but did not choke, noting how the old man's hands trembled slightly as they rose to steady the cup, though whether from age or weakness or emotion was impossible to say. When the blind man had drunk his fill, he lowered the cup and turned his face toward Kwame, and though his eyes saw nothing, there was something in his expression that made Kwame feel as if he was being examined more thoroughly than any seeing man had ever examined him, as if the blind man was reading his history in the timbre of his voice, in the gentleness of his hands, in the unhurried patience of his care. "Kwame," the blind man said slowly, as if tasting the name, rolling it around in his mouth like a wise man considering a proverb. "It is a good name, a name that means born on Saturday, does it not? Saturday's children are said to be lucky, to be blessed by the ancestors, to walk with fortune following in their footsteps even when they cannot see it. Tell me, Kwame, do you feel lucky? Do you feel blessed, breaking stones for bread while others sleep on soft mats and eat meat every day?" There was no mockery in the question, no trap being set, only genuine curiosity, as if the blind man truly wanted to understand how someone with so little could still maintain the kindness to help a stranger when doing so brought no obvious benefit. Kwame was quiet for a moment, the question hanging in the air between them like smoke from a cooking fire, visible and real but impossible to grasp with hands. He had never been asked such a thing before, had never stopped to consider whether luck or blessing followed him, for he had been too busy surviving to philosophize about the quality of his survival. But now, with the blind man's sightless eyes turned toward him like two moons waiting for sunrise, he found himself truly thinking about it, searching his heart for an answer that was honest rather than merely polite. "Elder," he finally said, his voice soft but certain, "I do not know if I am lucky in the way rich men measure luck, with gold and land and servants. But my mother taught me that luck is not always in what you have, but in what you can still give, and I can still give kindness. I can still see beauty in the sunrise. I can still help an elder cross the city safely. If these things make me lucky, then yes, I am the luckiest man alive. If they do not, then I am still content, for I sleep with a clear conscience, and that is worth more than all the soft mats and all the wealthy compounds." The blind man's hand, which had been resting lightly on Kwame's arm, suddenly gripped tighter, and his whole body seemed to shake once, violently, as if something inside him had broken free or broken apart. For a long moment, he said nothing, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that he made no attempt to hide. "Your mother was a wise woman, Kwame, wiser than most who claim wisdom, and she raised a son worthy of her teaching. I have walked these streets for 3 months now, ever since I lost my sight and everything else along with it, and in all that time, you are the first person who has stopped to help me without asking what reward I might offer, without calculating what advantage my gratitude might bring. You help because helping is what good people do, not because goodness pays wages or earns promotions." He paused, his breathing heavy, as if the words cost him something to speak, as if confession was harder work than walking blind through hostile streets. "Come, we must continue if we are to reach the gate before the sun climbs too high. You have already sacrificed enough of your time for an old beggar who can offer you nothing in return." But Kwame did not release the blind man's arm or quicken their pace toward the quarry where his wages awaited. Instead, he adjusted his grip to be more supportive and said with quiet determination, "Elder, you have offered me something in return already, though you may not realize it. You have reminded me why my mother's teachings matter, Why kindness is not wasted even when it is not rewarded. The quarry will still be there whether I arrive now or an hour from now, and the stones will not break themselves more easily if I rush. But you need to reach the eastern gate, and I have said I will help you there. So that is what I will do. And we will not speak of sacrifice or reward, for friends do not keep account books with one another. He used the word friends deliberately, elevating this chance encounter to something more intentional, something that carried mutual respect, rather than the hierarchy of helper and helped. The blind man's head turned sharply toward him at the word, and though his clouded eyes showed nothing, something in his face suggested that Kwame had just done something unexpected, something that mattered more than the young man could possibly understand. As they walked deeper into the city, the streets grew more crowded, filling with people rushing toward their own purposes, hawkers calling out their wares, children running errands, women balancing impossible loads on their heads, men arguing about prices or politics or the countless other things that men find to argue about when they gather in numbers. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony that must have been even more confusing for someone who could not use sight to orient themselves, who had to rely only on sound and the pressure of bodies moving past like a river that cares nothing for stones in its path. Kwame felt the blind man press closer to him, felt the old man's anxiety rising as the crowd thickened, felt the vulnerability of someone who cannot see the hand reaching out to push them aside or the obstacle appearing suddenly in their path. Without being asked, Kwame moved his own body to create a shield, positioning himself so that he absorbed the jostling and bumping, so that the blind man walked in a bubble of relative calm that Kwame's physical presence maintained through the chaos. "We are almost through the market district, Elder," he said reassuringly, his voice cutting through the noise, like a light through darkness. "Beyond this, the streets are quieter, and we can walk more easily." True to Kwame's word, they soon emerged from the market chaos into streets that breathed more slowly, where wealthy compounds rose behind high walls decorated with symbols of prosperity and power, where the very air seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if poverty was dust that could be kept out by walls high enough and gates strong enough. The blind man slowed his pace, his head turning from side to side in a way that suggested he was sensing something, perhaps the smell of specific trees, or the echo of his walking stick off particular walls, perhaps the texture of the ground beneath his feet changing from packed dirt to fitted stones. "This street," he murmured, more to himself than to Kwame. "I know this street. I walked here countless times when my eyes still worked, when my feet moved with purpose rather than stumbling. We are close now, very close. The eastern gate is just beyond that compound ahead, the one with the twin baobab trees, standing guard at its entrance. Can you see it, Kwame? Can you see the trees?" Kwame saw the trees, impossible to miss, their enormous trunks rising like pillars holding up the sky itself, their branches so wide that 100 people could shelter in their shade during the hottest part of the day. The compound wall between them was unlike any Kwame had seen before, built of stone so precisely fitted that no mortar was needed, so smoothly finished that it seemed to glow in the morning sun. The gate was closed but magnificent, carved from dark wood that must have come from forests far away, decorated with patterns that told stories Kwame could not read but sensed were important, sacred perhaps, or historical, marking this place as different from all other places. Guards stood at attention on either side, men whose very stance suggested they were not merely watchmen but warriors, men trained in combat, men who served someone of considerable power and importance. Kwame felt his steps slow involuntarily, felt a sudden nervousness rising in his chest, for he was a quarry worker, a stone breaker, a man who did not belong anywhere near compounds like this, and certainly not leading a ragged blind beggar toward gates that were clearly meant to keep people exactly like him outside. "Elder," Kwame said quietly, his voice uncertain now where it had been confident before. "Perhaps I should leave you here and find someone more appropriate to take you further. I am just a quarry worker, and these guards, this compound. It is clear that important people live here, people who would not welcome someone like me approaching their gate. Tell me who you seek here, and I will send word, but I should not go closer myself." He felt shame even as he spoke these words, shame at his own nervousness, at his sudden awareness of his ragged clothes and calloused hands, at the realization that the world had boundaries he had forgotten about while walking through dawn streets with a blind man who had made him feel, for a brief time, that kindness could erase all divisions. But the blind man's hand on his arm tightened, not releasing him, not giving him permission to disappear back into the comfortable anonymity of his own poverty. "Kwame," the blind man said, and his voice had changed again, had taken on a quality of command that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there, but hidden beneath the disguise of helplessness. "I have asked you to bring me to this gate, and you have done so with more kindness and patience than I had any right to expect. I ask one more favor. Walk with me to the gate itself. Let me lean on your arm when I speak to these guards. Do not abandon me now, when we have come so far together." So Kwame walked forward, each step feeling like moving deeper into water over his head, each pace bringing him closer to guards whose eyes tracked his approach with the intensity of hawks watching a mouse, each moment making him more aware that he was crossing invisible lines that society had drawn to separate people like him from people like whoever lived behind walls like these. The guards did not move to stop them, but neither did they step aside or offer greeting. They simply waited, their faces showing nothing, their bodies ready for whatever might come next. When Kwame and the blind man were perhaps 10 paces from the gate, one of the guards finally spoke, his voice flat and official, the voice of someone accustomed to turning away those who did not belong. "State your business here. This is the house of—" But he stopped mid-sentence, his eyes finally focusing properly on the blind man, really looking at him rather than dismissing him as just another beggar. The guard's face changed, color draining from it as if he had seen a ghost, his spear actually dropping slightly from its formal position as shock overwhelmed training. "No," the guard whispered, the word escaping his mouth like a prayer or a curse, impossible to tell which. "It cannot be. You are dead. We were told you were dead. 3 months ago, when you disappeared, when no trace could be found, when every messenger returned with empty reports, we were told to mourn, to accept that you had been lost forever. How are you standing here? How are you alive?" The guard's words tumbled over each other, making little sense to Kwame, who stood frozen beside the blind man, his mind trying to understand what was happening, why a guard at such an important compound would recognize a blind beggar, why the man's voice carried such shock mixed with what sounded almost like joy. The second guard had moved closer now, his face showing the same disbelief, and he too dropped to one knee, a gesture of respect so profound that Kwame's confusion only deepened, for people did not kneel to beggars, did not bow to blind men in rags, unless those men were not what they appeared to be, unless the rags hid something, unless the blindness masked an identity that changed everything. The blind man stood very still for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different again, no longer the weary voice of a lost elder seeking help, but something else, something that carried the weight of command that cannot be faked or borrowed, that comes only from a lifetime of being obeyed. "Stand up," he said quietly but firmly to the kneeling guards. "Stand up and open the gate. Send word to Administrator Femi that the master has returned. Tell him I am blind but alive, lost but now found, and that I have brought with me someone who must be honored, someone who has shown me more loyalty in one morning than many showed in years of plenty." He turned his head toward Kwame, and though his eyes still saw nothing, the gesture was unmistakable, the indication clear that he spoke of the young man still standing bewildered at his side. This young man, Kwame, who breaks stones for his bread, who has nothing but gives everything, who helped me without knowing who I was or what I could offer in return. He is to be brought inside, is to be treated with the respect due to someone who has saved my life. For though I am not dead physically, I was dead in spirit until this morning when a stranger reminded me that goodness still exists in this world. The gate opened slowly, its weight requiring 2 men to push it, and as it swung wide, Kwame saw beyond it a world he had never imagined entering, a courtyard that seemed like something from the stories his mother had told him about palaces in paradise, where water flowed in fountains carved from marble, where trees bloomed with flowers so bright they hurt the eyes, where the ground was not packed dirt, but fitted stones as smooth as cloth, where everything spoke of wealth and power and the kind of life that quarry workers only glimpsed from a distance, if they glimpsed it at all. Servants appeared from doorways around the courtyard, their faces showing the same shock the guards had displayed, their hands flying to their mouths or their hearts, their bodies bowing automatically in the presence of someone they clearly recognized despite his transformed appearance. A man in fine robes came running from the main building, his face a mixture of joy and disbelief, tears streaming down his cheeks without shame or restraint. "Master," he cried, his voice breaking. "Master, we thought you were lost forever. When you disappeared on your inspection of the outer districts, when your servants returned without you, when no ransom demand came, when every search party returned empty-handed, we mourned. The whole city mourned. How are you alive? What happened? Where have you been?" The blind man, though Kwame was beginning to understand that calling him merely the blind man was like calling the ocean some water, bent down and placed his hand on the weeping administrator's head, a gesture of comfort mixed with authority. "Stand up, Femi," he said gently. "There is time for explanations later. For now, know that I was attacked in the outer districts by men who wanted what I carried. They beat me and left me for dead in an alley where no one goes. When I woke 3 days later, my sight was gone, taken by the blows to my head, or perhaps by fever, or perhaps by the will of the gods, who wished to teach me something I could not learn any other way. I have spent 3 months wandering these streets blind and helpless, seeing how the city I govern treats its most vulnerable, learning what it means to be powerless in a place where power is everything. I have been mocked, ignored, pushed aside, stepped over, treated as invisible or worse than invisible. And in all that time, in all those encounters, only one person stopped to help me without asking for anything in return." He turned toward Kwame, his hand reaching out to find the young man's shoulder, gripping it firmly. "Only this quarry worker, this stone breaker who has nothing, offered me everything, his time, his care, his respect, his friendship. And now I ask you, Femi, what does that tell us about the city I govern? What does it say when the poorest among us holds more nobility than all the wealthy who pass me by?" Kwame felt his legs weaken beneath him, felt the world spinning as understanding finally penetrated his shock. The blind man he had been helping for the past 2 hours was not just someone rich, not merely someone important, but the governor himself, the one who ruled this entire city, who controlled its laws and its commerce, who determined the fate of thousands, whose word could raise up or cast down, who lived in a world so far above Kwame's that they should never have met at all, should never have walked arm in arm through dawn streets like equals, like friends. The governor had been testing him unknowingly, or perhaps the gods had been testing him through the governor, and he had passed or failed depending on how one calculated such things, though he supposed that since he was still being held by the shoulder rather than being dragged away by guards, he had probably passed, though he had not known there was a test, had simply been himself, had simply done what his mother had taught him good people do. "Elder Governor, my lord," Kwame stammered, not knowing what title to use, not knowing how to address someone he had been treating as a helpless beggar for the past 2 hours. "I did not know. I had no idea who you were. I only wanted to help because you needed help. I never expected. I never dreamed." His words tangled in his throat, coming out broken and confused, his mind unable to form coherent sentences in the face of this revelation that had turned his understanding of reality inside out. But the governor, for now Kwame could not pretend he was anyone else, tightened his grip on Kwame's shoulder and said with fierce intensity, "That is precisely why you are the only one worthy of reward, Kwame. You did not know who I was. You helped me when I could offer you nothing, when there was no advantage to be gained, no favor to be earned, no witness to applaud your kindness. You helped me because helping was the right thing to do, because your mother raised you to be a good man even when being good brings no immediate benefit. Do you understand how rare that is? Do you comprehend how many wealthy merchants passed me on the street without seeing me? How many nobles stepped over me without pausing? How many people who claimed to be righteous and godly ignored my suffering because I appeared to be someone beneath their notice?" His voice grew stronger with each question, anger seeping in now, not at Kwame, but at the city that had revealed itself to him during his 3 months of blindness, the city that smiled differently when you had power and looked away entirely when you had none. Administrator Femi had risen now and was standing with his head bowed, shame evident in his posture, for he understood what the governor was saying, understood the indictment being leveled not just against individuals, but against the entire society that they had created, a society where worth was measured by wealth and status rather than character and kindness. Other servants and officials had gathered now, drawn by the news that the governor had returned, and they too stood with bowed heads, perhaps sensing that they were witnessing not just a reunion, but a reckoning, that their master had returned changed by his experience, that the city they thought they knew was about to be transformed by the lessons he had learned while walking blind through streets he once governed with sight. The governor turned his face toward the assembled crowd, and though his eyes saw nothing, his voice saw everything. For 3 months I have learned what it means to be invisible in my own city. I have learned how the poor are treated, how the vulnerable are ignored, how those without power are dismissed as if they do not exist. I have learned that the laws I wrote sound beautiful in council chambers, but mean nothing in the streets where people actually live. I have learned that a society's true character is not revealed by how it treats its powerful, but by how it treats those who have no power at all. He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd like dust after a storm, then continued with a voice that had softened but somehow carried even more weight. But I have also learned that goodness still exists, that kindness has not died out entirely, that there are still people in this city who care for strangers without calculating profit. I have learned this because of Kwame, a quarry worker who has nothing but gave me everything that mattered, his time, his care, his respect, his friendship. He made me feel human again when 3 months of blindness had made me feel like nothing. He reminded me why I wanted to govern in the first place, why I believed that leadership should serve rather than merely rule. The governor turned back toward Kwame, and though he could not see the young man's face, he seemed to sense the overwhelming emotion there, the confusion mixed with fear, mixed with hope, mixed with a dozen other feelings that Kwame himself could not name. Kwame, you asked me earlier if I felt lucky, and I did not answer then. But I answer now. I am the luckiest man in this city, not because I have wealth or power or this magnificent compound, but because I met you this morning, because your kindness saved me from becoming bitter and hard, because you reminded me what true nobility looks like, and it does not wear fine robes or live behind high walls. It wears ragged work clothes and breaks stones for bread, but still finds time to help a blind beggar reach the eastern gate. Kwame could not stop the tears that came now, tears that he had not shed even during the worst days after his mother's death, tears that represented not sadness, but release, the release of years of being invisible, of being stepped over and ignored, of being dismissed as someone who did not matter because he had nothing to offer those who measure worth in gold and status. He had not helped the governor for recognition or reward. He had helped because helping was what good people do, because his mother had taught him that kindness was its own reward, because he could not walk past suffering without responding to it. But now, to be seen, to be valued, to have someone of immense power and authority declare that his kindness mattered, that his character was worth more than all the wealth in the city. It was overwhelming. It was too much. It broke something open inside him that he had not known was closed. The governor seemed to understand without being told, for he pulled Kwame close in an embrace that disregarded all protocol and propriety, that ignored the shocked gasps of the assembled crowd, that dismissed the social boundaries that said governors do not embrace quarry workers. "Cry if you need to, my friend," the governor said softly, his own voice thick with emotion. "The gods know we both have earned the right to tears." When they finally separated, the governor kept one hand on Kwame's shoulder and turned back toward Administrator Femi. His voice was calm now but carried unmistakable command. "Femi, I want you to understand what I am about to say and execute it exactly as I instruct. Kwame is no longer a quarry worker. From this day forward, he is appointed to my personal household with the title of Special Advisor for the Common Good. His job will be to walk through the city as he has always walked, to see what I could not see when I had sight and power, to tell me the truth about how my laws affect real people, to remind me and this entire administration that we serve the people, not ourselves. He will be paid a salary appropriate to his position. He will be given quarters here in the compound if he wishes, and his word will carry weight in my council, for he has proven that his judgment is better than that of men who claim wisdom but practice cruelty." The announcement created a ripple of shock through the assembled crowd, for such positions were usually given to the educated elite, to those with family connections, to those who understood the complex protocols of power. To give such a position to a barely literate quarry worker was unprecedented, was almost scandalous, was exactly the kind of thing a governor who had spent 3 months blind and learning would do. Kwame found his voice enough to stammer. "But Governor, I know nothing of administration or governance. I cannot read more than a few words. I have no education beyond what my mother taught me. I am not qualified for such a position. I will embarrass you. I will fail." But the governor cut him off with a gesture, his blind face turning toward Kwame with an expression that might have been a smile or might have been something fiercer, something more like determination. "You are more qualified than you know, Kwame. The men who fill my council chambers can read 1,000 books and write 1,000 laws, but you know something more important. You know how to be human. You know how to see another person's suffering and respond to it. You know that kindness is not a transaction, where you give only when you expect to receive. These things cannot be taught from books or learned in schools. They are taught by mothers who love their children enough to pass on wisdom that matters, and your mother clearly taught you well. As for failing me, you have already succeeded beyond every measure that matters. Everything else we can learn together." The governor turned back toward Femi and continued with more instructions, each one further cementing Kwame's new reality. "I also want you to send a team of builders to evaluate the room where Kwame has been living. If it is as small and inadequate as I suspect, I want it demolished and replaced with a proper house, built at city expense. A house large enough to honor the memory of his mother, who raised such a son. Furthermore, I want it made known throughout the city that any merchant or landlord who has ever overcharged Kwame or treated him poorly because of his poverty will answer personally to me. He is under my protection now, and anyone who harms him or speaks against him will discover that my blindness has not diminished my authority." The orders came swiftly, each one more generous than the last, and Kwame felt dizzy trying to comprehend how completely his life had changed in the space of a few hours, how the morning that had started with him walking to break stones had somehow led to this, to standing in the governor's courtyard being given a house and a position and protection, to being elevated from invisibility to honor, to being seen and valued in ways he had never imagined possible. But even his servants attended to him, bringing clean water to wash the quarry dust from his hands and face, bringing fine clothes to replace his ragged work shirt, even as Administrator Femi dispatched messengers to begin executing the governor's orders. Kwame felt a sudden panic rising in his chest, a fear that he was somehow betraying who he was, that accepting these gifts meant losing the simplicity and honesty that had made him worthy of them in the first place. "Governor," he said urgently, reaching out to touch the ruler's arm, "I am grateful beyond words for your generosity. But I must ask something. I must know something before I can accept all this. Will you require me to become someone different? Will I have to forget where I came from? Forget the people I worked beside at the quarry? Forget the struggles that taught me the kindness you value? Because if so, then I would rather return to breaking stones, for I would rather be poor and honest than wealthy and false." His voice shook as he spoke, for he was risking everything by questioning the governor's gifts. But he had to know, had to understand whether this transformation would cost him his soul. The governor's hands rose slowly, finding Kwame's face, his blind fingers tracing the young man's features with a touch that was gentle but also searching, as if trying to understand through touch what his eyes could no longer see. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply holding Kwame's face in his hands while the entire courtyard watched in silence, barely breathing, witnessing something sacred happening in their midst. When the governor finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried to every corner of the courtyard, ensuring that all would hear and remember. "Kwame, I do not want you to become someone different. I want you to remain exactly who you are. The young man who helps blind beggars without counting cost, who values conscience over comfort, who learned from his mother that kindness is not wasted even when it is not rewarded. I want you to keep your connection to the quarry workers and the market vendors and the struggling families who live at the city's edges. I want you to remain their voice in my council, to remember their needs when others forget, to ensure that the powerful do not trample the powerless simply because they can. The governor released Kwame's face, but kept one hand on his shoulder, then turned to address the crowd again, his voice growing stronger, taking on the tone of someone making a declaration that would outlive the moment. Let this day be remembered in the history of our city. Let it be recorded that the governor lost his sight but gained vision, that he wandered blind but found wisdom, that he was helped by the poorest among us and learned more from that kindness than from all his years of power. Let it be known that from this day forward, the measure of success in this city will not be how much wealth you accumulate or how high you climb, but how you treat those who have nothing to offer you in return. Let it be established that positions of honor will be given not only to those with education and connections, but also to those who demonstrate character and compassion. He paused, letting his words settle, then continued with even greater intensity. And let it be understood by every merchant, every noble, every wealthy family, that if I discover you have mistreated the poor, ignored the suffering, stepped over the vulnerable while pursuing your own advantage, you will answer to me personally, and my blindness will not prevent me from seeing your guilt clearly. The declaration hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, carrying weight and consequence that everyone present could feel. Some faces in the crowd showed inspiration, eyes bright with the possibility that their society might actually change, that kindness might matter more than status, that character might count for more than wealth. Other faces showed discomfort or even fear, for the governor's words threatened the comfortable hierarchies that had always determined who succeeded and who struggled, who was honored and who was ignored. Administrator Femi stepped forward, his voice formal but warm. It shall be done, Governor. Your declarations will be written into law, your instructions will be executed immediately, and your return will be celebrated throughout the city as the God's blessing upon us all. He turned toward Kwame and bowed, not the condescending bend of someone humoring a social inferior, but the genuine bow of respect from one person of worth to another. Welcome to the governor's household, Advisor Kwame. Your quarters will be prepared immediately, and if you require anything at all, you have only to ask. As servants led Kwame deeper into the compound to show him his new quarters, he kept looking back over his shoulder at the governor, at the man who had been a helpless blind beggar just an hour ago, but was now revealed to be the most powerful person in the city, at the unexpected friend who had transformed his life, not through magic or coincidence, but through the simple act of accepting help when it was offered, and then recognizing its worth. The quarters they showed him were larger than his entire previous home, with windows that looked out on gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors, with furniture carved from expensive wood, with soft mats for sleeping and cushions for sitting, and more space than one person could possibly need. Kwame stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, trying to comprehend that all of this was his now, that he would sleep here tonight instead of in the cramped room at the city's edge, that his life had changed so completely that he barely recognized it. One of the servants, an older woman with kind eyes, saw his overwhelmed expression and smiled gently. "It is a lot to take in all at once," she said, "but you will adjust. The governor has chosen well in selecting you, I think. We need people in this household who remember what it means to struggle." Kwame sat down carefully on one of the cushions, half expecting someone to rush in and tell him this was all a mistake, that quarry workers do not sit on furniture this fine, that he had misunderstood or presumed too much. But no one came to correct him. The room remained his. The transformation remained real. He thought about the quarry, about the men who would be breaking stones right now, wondering where he was, why he had not shown up for work. He thought about the quarry master who would be angry at his absence, who would never believe the truth even if Kwame could find a way to explain it. He thought about his small room at the city's edge, about the few possessions he had left there this morning when he set out for just another day of work, never imagining that he would not return to them as the same person who had left. Most of all, he thought about his mother, about the woman who had raised him with nothing but love and wisdom, who had taught him that kindness mattered even when it brought no visible reward, who had died never knowing that her teachings would one day be validated so spectacularly, so completely, in a way that would have made her weep with joy and pride. "Mama," he whispered to the empty room, to the spirit he believed still watched over him from whatever realm the dead inhabit. I wish you could see this. I wish you could know that everything you taught me mattered, that being kind even when it cost me something was worth it, that helping a stranger because it was the right thing to do led to this. I will try to honor your teaching in this new position. I will try to remember the struggles we endured together. I will try to use whatever influence I now have to help others who are struggling as we struggled. I promise you this, Mama. I will not forget where I came from." He wiped tears from his eyes, squared his shoulders, and stood up with renewed determination. He had been given an incredible opportunity, a chance to make a real difference in his city, to ensure that other people in his former position would be seen and valued and helped. He could not waste this chance. He would not waste it. His mother had not raised him to shrink from responsibility or to doubt his own worth. She had raised him to do what was right and trust that goodness would find its proper reward, and today her teaching had been proven true in ways neither of them could have imagined. As evening fell and lamps were lit throughout the city, Kwame stood on the balcony of his new quarters, looking out over streets he had walked countless times, but now saw from a completely different perspective. Somewhere down there, men were returning home from the quarry, their bodies aching from a full day of breaking stones, their minds already calculating whether they could afford bread or would have to go hungry tonight. Somewhere down there, other people were struggling with their own challenges, dealing with illness or poverty or the countless other difficulties that came with being powerless in a world that valued power above all else. Tomorrow, Kwame would begin learning his new role, would start finding ways to use his position to help those who needed help, would work to ensure that the governor's declaration was not just beautiful words, but actual change. But tonight, he allowed himself to simply stand and absorb the magnitude of what had happened, to marvel at the strange path destiny had taken to bring him here, to remember the morning when he had helped a blind beggar without knowing he was helping the most powerful man in the city, without expecting anything in return except the satisfaction of doing what his mother had taught him good people do. In another part of the compound, the governor sat while physicians examined his eyes, trying to determine whether his sight might be restored through treatment or whether the damage was permanent. But the governor found himself surprisingly unconcerned with their conclusions. His blindness had been a curse that became a blessing, a disability that became a teacher, a loss that led to gain more valuable than vision ever was. If the gods chose to restore his sight, he would be grateful. If they chose to leave him blind, he would accept it, for he had learned to see what truly mattered, and that seeing had nothing to do with eyes. He had learned that the greatest people often go unrecognized, that wisdom can be found in unexpected places, that a society reveals its true character not in how it treats the powerful, but in how it treats those who have no power at all. These lessons were worth more than any treasure in his vaults, worth more than any throne or title, worth the 3 months of suffering and humiliation that had been required to learn them. And he had learned them because one young quarry worker had stopped to help him, had given time and care without expecting reward, had demonstrated that nobility of character had nothing to do with birth or wealth or education, but everything to do with how you treated other human beings when no one was watching, when there was no advantage to be gained, when kindness was its own reward and its own reason. In the days that followed, word spread throughout the city about what had happened, about the governor's return after 3 months of being lost and blind, about his elevation of a quarry worker to a position of influence, about his declaration that character would matter more than status in determining who was honored and who was ignored. The story was told and retold, embellished and expanded, until it took on the quality of legend even though it had happened just days before. Some wealthy merchants grumbled that society was being turned upside down, that giving power to commoners would lead to chaos and disorder, that the governor had lost his mind along with his sight. But the poor and struggling heard the story differently. They heard it as hope, as validation that their struggles were not invisible, as proof that kindness mattered even when it brought no immediate reward, as demonstration that the gods noticed who helped and who turned away, who showed compassion and who showed cruelty. Market women told the story to their children as they worked. Old men repeated it in evening gatherings. Beggars whispered it to each other as they huddled in doorways at night, wondering if perhaps they too might one day be revealed as someone important in disguise, or if perhaps some Kwame might stop to help them even if they never turned out to be anyone important at all. The governor began implementing the changes he had declared, working closely with Kwame to understand how his laws affected real people's lives, to identify the gaps between beautiful intentions and harsh realities, to ensure that power served rather than merely ruled. Together they walked through the city, the governor still blind, Kwame serving as his eyes, describing what he saw, translating the visible world into words, while the governor translated those words into policies and reforms. They visited the quarry where Kwame had worked, where the governor felt the rough stones and heard the rhythm of hammers and understood in his body what he had only known intellectually before, that hard labor ground men down, that the wages he approved in comfortable chambers were barely enough to sustain life, that the people who built his city deserved more than exhaustion and poverty as their reward. They visited the markets where vendors struggled to make enough profit to feed their families, where the governor learned about the taxes and fees that seemed small in accounting books, but were crushing when you earned only copper coins. They visited the poorest districts where families lived in conditions the governor had never imagined, where children went hungry and sick people could not afford healers, and the elderly had no one to care for them in their final years. And with each visit, with each story he heard, with each person Kwame guided him to meet, the governor's determination to change things deepened. He drafted new laws that limited how much landlords could charge for rent, that ensured quarry workers received fair wages, that provided assistance for families who could not afford healers, that created positions for the elderly, so they could continue to contribute and earn dignity rather than becoming invisible burdens. Some of his advisors protested that these changes would be expensive, that they would upset the wealthy class, that tradition dictated society should function differently. But the governor would hear none of it. Tradition, he said with steel in his voice, is often just another word for comfortable injustice. We have always done it this way is not an argument for continuing, when the way we have always done it creates suffering that could be prevented. The city has wealth enough to take care of all its people if we choose to do so. If we choose not to, then we are choosing cruelty over kindness, and I will not choose cruelty. Not anymore. Not after learning what cruelty feels like from the receiving end. Months passed, and the changes began to take visible form throughout the city. New housing replaced dangerous structures. Food distribution centers opened in poor districts. Wages rose. Medical care became available to those who could not afford private healers. Programs were created to train young people in useful trades, so they would not have to break stones or beg for survival. The wealthy complained at first, angry about the increased taxes that funded these programs, resentful that their comfortable dominance was being challenged. But even they began to notice differences. Fewer beggars in the streets, less crime and desperation, more stability and peace. A city where people's basic needs were met was a safer, calmer, more prosperous city for everyone, even for those at the top. Not all the wealthy understood this, but enough did that the resistance weakened, that acceptance grew, that the new order began to feel normal rather than revolutionary. And everywhere, in market squares and compound courtyards, in quarries and workshops, people told the story of how it had all begun, with a young man helping a blind beggar, with kindness offered without expectation of reward, with a lesson about character mattering more than status. A year after that transformative morning, the city celebrated the anniversary of what they called the Day of Recognition, marking not just the governor's return but the lessons learned through his journey and Kwame's kindness. The governor stood before a massive crowd in the central square, his vision partially restored. He could see light and shadow, could distinguish day from night, could perceive movement and vague shapes, though details remained beyond him. But he no longer needed perfect sight to see what mattered. Beside him stood Kwame, no longer wearing the ragged clothes of a quarry worker, but not wearing anything ostentatious either, his style somewhere between poverty and luxury, as if he had found a balance that honored both where he came from and where he was now. The governor raised his hand for silence, and when the crowd quieted, he spoke in a voice that had grown both gentler and stronger through the year's experiences. My friends, we gather today not to celebrate my return, but to celebrate what my loss and return taught us all. When I walked these streets blind and helpless, I learned that our city had become a place where the fortunate ignored the suffering, where the wealthy stepped over the struggling, where power had forgotten its purpose was to serve rather than merely to rule. He paused, letting his words settle, then continued with quiet intensity. But I also learned, through one young man's simple act of kindness, that goodness still existed, that compassion had not died out completely, that there were still people in this city who cared for strangers without calculating profit or advantage. Kwame helped me when I could offer him nothing, when there was no benefit to helping, when he was already late for work and would lose wages because of his kindness. He helped me because his mother had taught him that helping was what good people do, regardless of the cost or the reward. And his kindness changed everything, not just his life and mine, but the entire character of our city. The governor turned toward Kwame, his partially restored sight allowing him to see the young man's outline if not his features, and his voice softened with genuine affection. Kwame, you told me once that you did not know if you were lucky. I say today, in front of all these witnesses, that you are the luckiest person I know, not because I elevated you or gave you wealth, but because you possess something wealth cannot buy and power cannot grant. You possess a character shaped by love and hardship, refined by your mother's teaching and your own choices, a character that remains kind even when kindness costs something, remains humble even when pride would be easier, remains true even when falseness would be more profitable. Kwame bowed his head, overwhelmed by the public recognition, still uncomfortable with being celebrated even after a year of learning to accept his new position. When the governor gestured for him to speak, he stepped forward hesitantly, his voice quieter than the governor's, but carrying its own kind of power, the power of authenticity and lived experience. Friends, he began, using the same term he used at the quarry, refusing to speak down to people who were like him in every way except luck and timing. I did nothing special that morning. I simply helped someone who needed help, as all of us should do, as all of us can do, as my mother taught me good people must do regardless of whether anyone is watching or rewarding. The governor honors me, but I share that honor with every person in this city who has ever stopped to help a stranger, who has ever given when they had little, who has ever shown kindness without counting the cost. We are all capable of changing lives through simple acts of compassion. We are all powerful when we choose to use that power to lift others rather than push them down. The feast that followed was unlike any the city had ever seen, for the governor had insisted that everyone be invited, that the celebration include quarry workers and nobles, beggars and merchants, the powerful and the powerless sitting together at long tables set throughout the square, sharing food and stories, and the growing sense that they were building something new together, something better than what they had before. Kwame found himself surrounded by people who wanted to thank him, who wanted to tell him about how the new laws had helped their families, who wanted to share their own stories of struggling and surviving and hoping for better days. An old woman grabbed his hand and told him through tears that her grandson had been trained as a carpenter through the new apprenticeship program, that he would never have to break stones as his father had, that he had a future now, where before there had been only exhaustion and poverty. A young mother showed him her healthy baby, explaining that without the new medical assistance programs, the child would have died from an illness they could not afford to treat. A former quarry worker, now employed in the new construction projects that were rebuilding poor districts, embraced Kwame like a brother and whispered, "You remembered us. You got lifted up and you reached back down. Thank you." As evening deepened and the celebration continued, Kwame slipped away from the crowds, seeking a quiet moment to breathe and reflect, to absorb everything that had happened not just today, but over the past year, to marvel at how completely his life had changed because he had done one simple thing, helped a stranger who needed help. He found himself in a garden within the compound, surrounded by flowers that bloomed white and luminous in the moonlight, their fragrance sweet and clean on the night air. He was not surprised when the governor joined him, moving through the garden with the careful steps of someone whose vision was imperfect but whose sense of place was strong. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, two men from completely different worlds who had somehow become friends, who had learned from each other lessons that neither could have learned alone. Finally, the governor spoke, his voice thoughtful and quiet. "Kwame, do you ever regret it? Helping me that morning, I mean. Your life was simpler before, less complicated. Now you carry the weight of responsibility, the burden of trying to help an entire city instead of just breaking stones and going home. Do you ever wish you had just walked past me, kept going to the quarry, stayed in the life you knew? Kwame was quiet for a long moment, truly considering the question rather than offering an easy answer, respecting the governor's inquiry enough to search for truth rather than politeness. I would be lying if I said it has all been easy, Governor. There are days when I miss the simplicity of breaking stones, of having no decisions to make except whether to eat now or save the bread for later. There are nights when I lie awake worrying about whether the programs we create will actually help or whether we are missing something important, whether I am wise enough to advise someone as powerful as you. There are moments when I feel like an imposter, like a quarry worker playing dress-up in positions he does not truly deserve. He paused, looking up at the stars that looked the same, whether you were poor or wealthy, whether you broke stones or governed cities. But then I think about my mother, about what she would say if she could see me now. And I know she would tell me that the universe gives us opportunities to serve, and we must take those opportunities even when they scare us, even when they require more than we think we can give. Because service is the highest calling. Because using whatever gifts we have to help others is why we are here. The governor smiled, his partially restored sight not quite adequate to see Kwame's expression, but his other senses reading the young man's tone and energy clearly enough. Your mother would be more than proud, Kwame. She would be astonished at how well her teaching took root, at how completely you embody the values she gave you. And I. His voice caught slightly, emotion breaking through. I am grateful beyond words that you stopped that morning, that you helped me without knowing who I was, that your kindness gave me a chance to learn what I needed to learn, to become a better governor than I was before, to see my city with the eyes of the heart rather than the eyes of the flesh. You reminded me why I wanted to govern in the first place, why I believed that power should serve rather than merely dominate. For that, I will be eternally grateful. They embraced then, two men from different worlds who had found common ground in shared values, in mutual respect, that character counted for more than status, that a society built on compassion was stronger than one built on hierarchy alone. Years passed, and Kwame grew into his role completely, becoming not just the governor's advisor, but a beloved figure throughout the city, someone who represented the possibility of transformation. That character could elevate anyone regardless of where they started. The governor's sight never fully returned, but he governed better blind than he had with perfect vision, seeing more clearly with his heart than he ever had with his eyes. Together, they transformed the city into a place where kindness mattered, where the vulnerable were protected, where power served rather than merely ruled. The changes were not perfect. No human society ever is, but they were real and meaningful, creating opportunities that had not existed before, offering hope where there had been only despair, demonstrating that a different way was possible when leaders cared more about character than status, more about service than dominance. And always, in every speech the governor gave, in every policy they implemented, in every decision they made, they returned to the core lesson that had started everything, that true greatness often hides behind humble appearances, that power that does not serve as tyranny, that kindness is never wasted even when it seems to cost more than it gives. When Kwame grew old, he would sit with his own children and grandchildren, for he married eventually, a woman as kind-hearted as he was, and they built a family on the foundation of the values his mother had given him, and tell them the story of the morning that changed his life and changed their city. He would describe waking before dawn, walking through quiet streets, hearing the tap-tap-tap of a blind man's walking stick, making the choice to help without knowing what that choice would bring. And he would tell them what he wanted them to understand, what he needed them to carry forward into their own lives and teach to their own children when the time came. The universe, he would say, his voice still strong despite his years, is always watching, always testing, always waiting to see if we will look with our hearts instead of our eyes, if we will measure worth by character instead of status, if we will help those who need help simply because helping is what good people do. You never know when the person you help might be someone important in disguise, but more importantly, you never know when helping someone might change you into the person you need to become, might teach you lessons you could learn no other way, might open doors you did not even know existed. The city Kwame and the governor transformed continued to grow and flourish, becoming known throughout the region not for its wealth or power, but for its compassion, its justice, its commitment to caring for all its people regardless of their status or circumstances. Other cities sent representatives to learn how they had achieved this transformation, to understand the policies and programs that made such a difference. But the answer was always the same, always coming back to one simple truth. Everything had started with one act of kindness, one young man helping one blind beggar, one moment when someone chose to care without expecting anything in return. That was the seed from which everything else grew, the foundation on which an entire society rebuilt itself. The reminder that the greatest revolutions do not begin with armies or laws, but with individual choices to do what is right even when no one is watching, even when there is no obvious reward, even when it costs you something to care. So listen well to this story. Remember it. Carry it in your heart when you walk through your own streets and encounter your own opportunities to help. For you never know when the blind man you assist will turn out to be the governor of your city. But more importantly, you never know how your kindness might change you, might transform someone else, might ripple outward in ways you cannot imagine, creating a better world not through grand gestures, but through simple human compassion, one act of helping at a time. Until gradually, imperceptibly, everything has changed, and people look back and wonder when it happened, when the world became kinder, when society learned to care for its vulnerable, when power remembered that its highest purpose is to serve rather than merely to rule. The answer is always the same. It happened when one person helped one stranger one ordinary morning, when kindness was offered freely, without expectation of reward, when someone remembered that we are all connected, all responsible for each other, all capable of creating change through the simple choice to care. That is the lesson. That is the truth. That is why this story matters, and why it must be told and retold, passed from generation to generation, whispered to children and proclaimed to crowds, remembered when we are tempted to walk past suffering, recalled when we forget that every person we meet carries invisible worth regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Help the stranger. Show the kindness. Offer the compassion. For you never know when you are entertaining angels, when you are assisting governors, when you are planting seeds that will grow into forests that will shelter thousands, when your smallest action is actually your most significant contribution, when the blind man asking for your arm is actually the owner of the entire city. Testing whether anyone still remembers that greatness often hides behind humble appearances, waiting to see if we will look with our hearts instead of our hands. If we will measure worth by character instead of gold, if we will still choose kindness even when kindness seems to cost more than it gives. Choose kindness. Always choose kindness. For in the end, when all is measured and weighed, when all possessions are surrendered and all status is stripped away, when we stand before whatever judgment awaits us all, the only thing that will matter is how we treated others when we had the choice to help or to walk past, to care or to ignore. To be the kind of person who makes the world better simply by moving through it with an open heart and willing hands. That is the measure of a life well lived. That is the legacy worth leaving. That is why the story of Kwame and the blind governor echoes through time, reminding us all that we are never too poor to be generous, never too busy to be kind, never too insignificant to make a profound difference in someone's life and thereby in the world itself.